economics is not really his strong suit, and certainly not monetary innovations. What I can say is that clearly China has blazed a trail in the last few years in a couple of quite different domains. The first is electronic payments, because the scale that Alibaba was able to create for its electronic payments platform, and the scale that Tencent's WeChat Pay was able to establish, have no counterparts in the West. PayPal never got, even in relative terms, to this scale. And so China leapt ahead in payments in an amazingly short space of time. And I noticed this because I was going to Beijing every year to teach at Tsinghua, something I haven't been able to do this year. But each year you'd see fewer banknotes, you'd see no credit cards, and each year you'd see more people paying with their phones. And so talking to my Chinese students and colleagues, I was fascinated by the scale of this transformation, got to know some of the people involved, including people in Hangzhou, at Alibaba, and particularly at Ant, and also had some interesting conversations in Shenzhen with the folks at Tencent, and learnt a lot and realized that this was one way in which China was pulling ahead of the United States, because in a way China, because its banking system had lagged behind, was able to kind of leapfrog into a new mode of payment because it didn't have all the legacy that we have, and we are very habituated in the United States to using plastic, to using credit and debit cards, and that wasn't really a phase that the Chinese population went through. So that's part one of the story. Part two of the story is that the People's Bank of China, eager to try to think of ways to increase use of its currency outside China, but also to improve the efficiency of its own policy inside China, came up with the idea that they were going to do some kind of central bank digital currency. And this was being discussed a good deal last year. But I mean, as late as last November, there was still no real clarity about when this was going to happen and how exactly it was going to happen. There really wasn't much detail. And I talked to PBOC people when I was last in China late last year and came away thinking they aren't really ready for prime time. The pandemic changed that, and this is another way in which the pandemic speeds history up. I think the Chinese decided that they had an opportunity to accelerate development of their digital currency and to run some trials, not least because they saw it as a way quickly to transfer money to citizens. Now, what is the objective here? It is a different objective from the objective of Ant, which is to build a payments platform that becomes the standard in as much of the world as possible, not just in China. I think that the PBOC and the Communist Party generally have a different priority, which is to have a complete overview of all the transactions going on in China itself. Remember, this is a regime that had to impose capital controls in an exchange rate crisis back in 2015. It is a regime which, since its very inception in 1949, has prioritized surveillance of its population and sees technology as a way of making that perfect. The trouble with banknotes is they don't really tell you what people did with them. They are, in that sense, the true cryptocurrency. And for a regime like China's, getting rid of banknotes and putting everything on a centralized, underline that 3 times, centralized database is highly attractive. So I don't think we should confuse these two initiatives. The electronic payments platforms from the private sector, from the big tech companies, are one part of China's advance, but the central bank digital currency is another, and they're not entirely, I think, in sync with one another. Indeed, it's clear that the party is wary of big tech. That's why the Ant Group IPO got pulled at the last minute, because Jack Ma had pissed off the party and the regulators in China. All that really amounts to a very simple proposition, though. China is ahead of the United States in electronic payments and in terms of digital currency. And the United States has become the financially conservative power. We like, or at least the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve like, the world the way it is, where the dollar is the reserve currency. It's a fiat currency produced by the Federal Reserve and the American banking system. There is no constraint on that. As long as the world wants dollars, the US government has a seemingly limitless borrowing capacity. And crucially, because the US dominates a dollar-based payment system, it can apply financial sanctions very readily by threatening to cut people out of the SWIFT international interbank payment system. So we like that system. It is very, very helpful from the vantage point of wielding American power. But as I have been saying to people in Washington for what feels like the last 2 years, that is a strategy for obsolescence. You are clinging to 1970s technology, and you are missing out on the financial revolution that's happening almost everywhere else. I mean, it's not just that China's ahead. Sometimes I think South America is ahead of North America in fintech. And we are kind of sitting there saying, don't change the system, it suits us too well. And the rest of the world is obviously incentivized to change the system, because as long as the US dominates payments, the US is able to wield financial sanctions at very low cost. And every country just about has to jump. So I think that's the kind of geopolitical story here. In the context of Cold War II, fintech and particularly monetary innovation are really important, because they're one of the ways that I think China has actually pulled ahead.